Lyra's antennae twitched before her eyes, even registered the data on the screen. Something was wrong. The signal that cut across her monitoring console was raw, unfiltered, and broadcasting on every frequency at once. That was not how civilized species communicated. That was how dying one screamed. She sat in the communications bay of the Galactic Concord Monitoring Station, known as Harmony's Veil, a massive orbital platform that floated in the cold dark between stars at the edge of the Orion Spur. Lyra was a Velathi, a slender, bioluminescent insectoid barely taller than a human child with 4 delicate arms and compound eyes that glowed soft amber in the dim light of her work station. She was young, freshly assigned, and, until 30 seconds ago, deeply bored. Now her hearts were hammering. She cleaned the signal, stripped away the static, and played it back. Voice that filled her headset was Dravani. She recognized the sharp, musical tone of their language, the way their words rose and fell like birdsong. But this voice was not singing, it was begging. To any who hear this, the swarm has come. Our fleets are broken, our worlds burn. We beg the conquered, send anyone. Send anything, please, we are dying. The message repeated over and over, an automated loop from a civilization that no longer had time to send anything else. Lyra's glow dimmed to almost nothing, which was what happened to Velathi when they were terrified. She routed the signal to her supervisor. Within the hour it had reached the Galactic Concord Council. The council was the closest thing the galaxy had to a governing body. It was made up of representatives from over 200 species, most of whom had evolved on gentle worlds with mild climates, low gravity, and ecosystems that did not actively try to murder their inhabitants. They were scientists, philosophers, traders, and diplomats. They were not warriors. They had not needed to be warriors for a very long time. The emergency session convened aboard the council's grand chamber, a vast, ring-shaped hall filled with hovering platforms, each one carrying a delegate from a different species. The air was thick with the chemical signatures of dozens of alien biologies, and the noise was immense. Everyone was talking, no one was agreeing. The situation was simple and terrible. The Kreth swarm, a hyper-aggressive collective intelligence made up of billions of bioorganic creatures that traveled through space in living ships, had emerged from deep space and struck the Dravani sovereignty without warning. The Dravani were a peaceful civilization of avian reptilians who lived on 3 garden worlds in the Palace Reach sector. Their military was small, designed for border patrols and stopping pirates. Against the swarm, they had lasted less than 2 days. Now the swarm was consuming everything. It stripped planets of biomass, plants, animals, cities, people. It ate worlds, the way fire ate paper, and it was growing larger with every meal. The council argued. Some delegates proposed sending a diplomatic envoy to attempt communication with the swarm. Others pointed out with barely disguised panic that no one had ever successfully communicated with the swarm. Because the swarm did not talk, it consumed. A block of species from the inner systems proposed a quarantine seal off the Palace Reach, sacrifice the Dravani, and use the time their deaths bought to build defenses. Lyra, watching from an observation gallery above the chamber, felt sick. She had studied the Dravani in school. They were artists. They carved their histories into the walls of crystal towers and sang their children to sleep, with songs older than most starfaring civilizations. And the council was talking about letting them die to buy time. Then the human spoke. Director Alara Ase stood on humanity's platform near the outer ring of the chamber. She was not a large woman. Her hair was gray-streaked and pulled back, her face calm, her hands clasped behind her back. She had served as Earth's ambassador to the Conquered for 11 years, and in that time she had earned a reputation for saying very little and meaning every word. The chamber fell quiet when she activated her platform speaker, not out of respect, Lyra thought, out of something closer to unease. Humanity occupied a strange place in the Conquered. They had joined 60 years ago, and in that time they had been model citizens, polite, cooperative, eager to trade and share knowledge, but everyone knew what they were. Earth was classified as a Class 12 death world. Its gravity was crushing. Its climate swung between burning heat and killing cold. Its oceans were filled with predators, its land swarming with venomous creatures, its weather systems capable of leveling cities. The fact that intelligent life had evolved there at all was considered freak accident by most xenobiologists. Humans were heavy, they were strong. They healed from injuries that would kill most species. They could run for hours without stopping, survive on almost any food source, and function without sleep for days. They were, by every measurable standard, apex predators from a world that produced nothing but apex predators. And they had brought warships. No one in the Conquered had a real military fleet. Humanity had arrived at the galactic stage with one already built, forged through centuries of fighting each other on their terrible world. They had politely agreed to keep their weapon systems in their home system. The council had politely agreed to pretend those weapons did not exist. Osa looked across the chamber. When she spoke, her voice was steady and clear, and it carried the quiet weight of something that had already been decided. We'll go. The silence that followed was absolute. A Conquered elder, a towering tree-like creature from a low-gravity forest world, leaned forward on its platform. Director Osa, the palace reaches 6. Relay jumps from Saul. And GT snorts. And GT, the swarm numbers in the billions. What you are suggesting is logistically possible, Osa said. She smiled. It was a small smile, polite and warm, and it made Larry's blood run cold. You haven't seen what we brought with us. She stepped back and said nothing more. 12 hours later, deep within Saul's system, past the orbital shipyard circling Titan, and the silent weapons platforms that drifted in the darkness of the Kuiper Belt, a priority black transmission arrived at United Earth Fleet Command. In 100 berths carved into the rock of asteroids and hidden inside hollowed moons, running lights flickered on. Reactors that had been sleeping for years roared back to life. Hull plates groaned as docking clamps released. Crews who had trained their entire lives for a call like this moved to their stations with the calm, practiced urgency of professionals who understood exactly what was about to happen. The first expeditionary war fleet began to wake up, and somewhere on the bridge of the dreadnought Thermopylae, Admiral Kalen Rourke read the mission briefing, closed the file, and looked out at the stars. About time, he said quietly. Lyra had never been so afraid in her life, and she was standing in what the humans called a mess hall, surrounded by People eating lunch. She had been assigned as the Galactic Concord's official liaison to the human fleet. It was supposed to be an honor. The Council wanted eyes on whatever the humans were about to do, and Lyra was the officer who had intercepted the Dravani distress signal. She spoke fluent Terran standard. She had the security clearance. She was on paper the perfect candidate. In reality, she was a 4FT tall, insected from a world with half of Earth's gravity, and she was standing inside a warship that was 3.2 km long and designed from the ground up to kill things. The UES Thermopylae was the flagship of the first expeditionary war fleet, and it was the most terrifying object Lyra had ever seen. From the outside, it looked like a mountain of dark metal, covered in weapons. Railgun batteries lined its spine in rows. Missile bays sat recessed in its flanks like wounds. Fighter launch decks opened along its belly, each one large enough to hold a Velathi cargo hauler. The ship did not look like it had been built. It looked like it had been forged, hammered into shape by something angry. The fleet itself was enormous. 142 warships ranging from fast attack corvettes barely larger than a shuttle to carrier groups that moved in slow, deliberate formations surrounded by clouds of escort ships. Behind the combat vessels came the troop transports, heavy armored boxes carrying the Death World Marine Corps. Lyra had read the briefing files on the Marines. She wished she had not. Human soldiers were already frightening. By galactic standards, they were endurance predators. Their ancestors had hunted prey on Earth by simply chasing it until it collapsed. From exhaustion, they could function in temperature extremes that would kill Velathi in minutes. They healed from broken bones in weeks. They could lose limbs and survive. The Marines were all of that, plus enhancements, combat augmentation, sharpened their reflexes and strengthened their muscles. Powered exoskeletons multiplied their already absurd strength by a factor of 10. Their armor was sealed against hard, vacuum-toxic atmospheres and biological contamination. They trained for years to fight in every environment imaginable: deserts, jungles, frozen wastelands, the void of space itself. And they were eating sandwiches and laughing about something. Lyra stood near the entrance of the mess hall, her glow flickering with anxiety, watching 200 Marines eat, joke, and argue about something called football. One of them noticed her standing there and waved her over. She approached the table on shaking legs. "You're the Concord liaison, right?" the Marine said. She was a young woman with brown skin, short-cropped black hair, and a scar that ran from her left ear to her jaw. Her name tag read Sia S. Tilloj. Her rank was sergeant. She smiled, and it was a surprisingly warm smile for someone who was technically a biological weapon. "I am Lyra," Lyra said. "Velathi. Communications Division. Joe Castillo, 12th Division, 2nd. Platoon, sit down. You look like you're about to pass out." Lyra sat. The bench was too tall for her, and her legs dangled. A Marine across the table, a giant red-haired man with arms like tree trunks, pushed a glass of water toward her without being asked. "First time on a human ship?" Castillo asked. "First time near humans," Lyra admitted. Her voice was small. Castillo nodded like this was completely normal. "It's a lot, I know. The gravity alone probably feels heavy for you." It did. Earth standard gravity was nearly twice what Lyra was used to. Every step felt like walking through mud, but it was not the gravity that frightened her, it was everything else. "Can I ask you something?" Lyra said. "Sure. You are all going to war. You may die. Many of you will die." She paused, trying to find the right words. "Why does everyone seem happy?" Castillo leaned back and thought about it. The mess hall hummed around them. The clatter of trays, bursts of laughter, someone singing badly in the corner. "We're not happy about the dying part," Castillo said, "but here's the thing, our whole species was built by surviving things that wanted to eat us. Every instinct we've got, going back millions of years, says the same thing. When something threatens people who can't protect themselves, you run toward the danger, not away from it. It's not bloodlust, it's the reason we're still alive." She shrugged. "So, yeah, we're scared, but we're also doing exactly what we were made to do. There's a kind of peace in that." Lyra did not fully understand, but she filed the words away, sensing they were important. Over the next several days she moved through the fleet and observed. She watched damage control teams practice sealing hull breaches while fires burned around them. She watched fighter pilots run simulations in their cockpits, their hands moving faster than her eyes could track. She visited the medical bays, which were not the calm, sterile places she expected. They were trauma surgery factories designed to put broken humans back together fast enough to send them back into the fight. She attended Admiral Rourke's tactical briefing in the Thermopylae war room. The Admiral was a tall, weathered man, his 50s, with gray eyes and a voice that never rose above a conversational tone. Even when he was describing the end of a civilization, he stood before a holographic display that showed the Palace Reach sector. 3 Dravani worlds marked in blue, the swarm's forces marked in red. There was a lot of red. "The Kreth swarm uses overwhelming numbers," Rourke said. "Their ships are bioorganic, grown, not built. They don't retreat, they don't negotiate. They snort, consume biomass, and use it to produce more of themselves. Every world they eat makes them stronger." He let that sink in, then continued. "The good news is this makes the tactical picture simple. Everything in front of us is a target. We don't need to figure out who the enemy is. We just need to kill enough of them to break their hold on the Dravani home world and give those people a chance to survive." A destroyer captain raised a hand. "Admiral, what's the estimated swarm strength in orbit around Palava's prime?" "Current projections say somewhere between 8 and 12,000 bioships." The room was quiet. "We have 142 ships," the captain said. "I'm aware of the math," Rourke said. There was no worry in his voice. There was no bravado either, just a flat, steady certainty. "We're not here to match them ship for ship. We're here to hit them harder than they've ever been hit and make them choke on it." Lyra watched the humans in that room. None of them looked away, none of them argued, they just nodded and started planning. 3 days later, the fleet dropped out of faster-than-light transit at the edge of the Palace Reach. The stars shifted, and suddenly the holographic displays were filled with real data instead of projections. Palaven Prime hung in the void ahead of them, a beautiful blue-green world, wrapped in white clouds and surrounding it like a swarm of insects around a dying animal were thousands upon thousands of Kreth Bayer ships. Their organic hulls pulsed with dark light. They moved in patterns that were not quite random and not quite organized, the twitching, hungry movements of a collective mind that sensed new prey. Lyra stood in the combat information center behind Rourke's command chair. Her glow had gone completely dark. She could not speak. Rourke studied the display for a long moment, then he straightened. "All ships battle stations," he said. His voice carried across the fleet, through every speaker on every ship. "Launch all fighter wings, weapons free. On my mark." He paused. "Signal the swarm on all frequencies. Let them know who just arrived." The message went out. It was simple. It was broadcast in every language the Concord had on file, and in every electromagnetic band the swarm might be able to detect. It said, "This is the United Earth Fleet. We are here for the Dravani. Stand down or be destroyed." The swarm did not stand down. It never did. But for the first time in its long, hungry existence, it was about to learn what a death world could do. The swarm did what it always did. It attacked. A wall of bioships, thousands of them, each one a twisted mass of chitin, muscle and bone grown into something between a creature and a vessel, broke away from the orbital cluster around Palaven's prime and surged toward the human fleet. They moved fast, far faster than anything that large should have been able to move, driven by biological engines that burned consumed biomass as fuel. They did not fly in formation. They simply charged, a living wave of teeth and hunger aimed at the newcomers who dared to enter their feeding ground. Every other species the swarm had encountered had done the same thing. When faced with that charge, they ran, they scattered, they broke formation and tried to flee, and the swarm caught them one by one and tore them apart. The human fleet did not scatter. Admiral Rurik stood at the Thermopylae Combat Information Center, surrounded by holographic displays that painted the void in blue and red. He watched the swarm wave approaching, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. Swarm elements closing, 90 seconds to weapons range, his tactical officer reported. "Hold formation," Rurik said. The fleet had arranged itself into what human military doctrine called a hammer and anvil. The heavy ships, dreadnoughts and battle cruisers, the largest and most armored vessels in the fleet, formed a solid wall at the front. Behind them the carriers and their escort ships held back, fighter wings already launched in, circling in vast clouds of metal and fire. On the flanks, fast attack corvettes waited like wolves watching a herd. 60 seconds. All ships lock targets, railgun batteries prepare for broadside on my command. Lyra stood at the back of the CIC, pressed against a wall, trying to make herself as small as possible. Her compound eyes could see every display at once, and every display showed the same thing, a tide of red closing on a thin line of blue. The numbers were insane. For every human ship, there were at least 60 swarm vessels. This was not a battle. This was a species throwing itself against a wall of teeth. 30 seconds. 20. 10. Rex's voice did not waver. All ships fire. The universe turned white. Every railgun on every dreadnought. The line fired simultaneously. Railguns did not use explosives. They used electromagnetic force to accelerate solid metal slugs to a fraction of the speed of light. Each slug was small, barely the size of a human fist, but at those velocities, it carried more energy than a nuclear warhead, hundreds of them, ripped through space in the span of a heartbeat, and where they hit swarm bioships, they did not punch holes, they vaporized them. The first wave of the swarm char simply ceased to exist. Hundreds of bioships became expanding clouds of organic debris, but behind them were thousands more, and they kept coming. The swarm hit the dreadnought line like an ocean hitting a cliff. Bioships slammed into human vessels with the full force of their mass, trying to latch on, trying to chew through armored hulls. With acid and claw, the Thermopylae shuddered as 3 bioships rammed its port side simultaneously. Alarms screamed, bulkheads cracked. The lower decks, fires broke out as ruptured conduits sprayed superheated coolant into corridors. And the humans kept fighting. That was the thing that broke Lyra's understanding of the galaxy. Conquered species built their ships to avoid damage. Their doctrine was simple: if a ship was hit badly, it retreated. A ship that could not retreat was considered lost, but human ships were not built to avoid damage. They were built to absorb it. Redundant power systems, backup life support, secondary and tertiary command bridges, armored internal bulkheads designed to contain fires and decompressions. Human ships expected to be hit. They expected to burn. They expected crew to die, and they kept fighting anyway. The dreadnought Viridian took a direct ramming attack that tore away a third of its forward hull. Atmosphere vented into space. 200 crew died in the first 10 seconds. The ship listed, trailing fire and debris. And GT snorts. And GT, and then its remaining rail gun batteries open up again, pouring fire into the swarm at point-blank range. It fought for another 40 minutes before its reactor finally failed. Behind the dreadnought line, the carrier groups unleashed their fighter wings. Thousands of small, fast-strike craft, each one piloted by a single human, dove into the gaps in the swarm's formation. They moved in pairs and small groups, targeting the nerve clusters that coordinated swarm movement and the reproductive nodes where new bioships were being grown from consumed material. The fighters were fast and agile, but they were also fragile. Dozens were lost in the first minutes. The rest kept going. Meanwhile, on the surface of Palavans Prime, far below, something far worse was happening. The swarm's ground forces had overrun most of the northern continent. They were massive chitinous creatures, some the size of dogs, some the size of houses, that moved in endless waves across the landscape, consuming everything organic they encountered. Forests were reduced to bare soil. Cities were stripped to their foundations. Rivers ran thick with biological waste. The last Dravani stronghold was the ancient capital city of Valith, nestled in a mountain valley behind energy shields that were failing more with every passing hour. Inside, 2 million civilians huddled in underground shelters, while the remnants of the Dravani military held the walls. Talon General Soreth stood on the highest tower of Valith's inner citadel, watching the swarm mass on the plains below. He was old for a Dravani. His feathers had gone silver, and his left wing hung crooked from a wound taken in the first hours of the invasion. He had fought with everything he had. It had not been enough. His aide approached. General, the shields will fail within 6 hours. Soreth nodded. He had already written his final message to the conquered. He had already said goodbye to what remained of his family. He had made peace with dying here in the city his ancestors had built 10,000 years ago. Then the sky broke open. Soreth saw them before he heard them. Streaks of fire cutting through the upper atmosphere, dozens of them. Hundreds falling like meteors toward the plains outside Valith. They hit the ground with impacts that shook the mountain beneath his feet, and where they landed, clouds of dust and fire erupted. Drop pods, human drop pods. The 12th Death World Marine Division had arrived. They came out of their pods already, fighting 2,000 Marines empowered exoskeletons, each one carrying enough firepower to level a city block, hit the ground in a ring around Volley's perimeter, and immediately engage the swarms. Ground forces. Sergeant Josefa Castillo was among the first out. Her boots hit scorched earth. Her rifle was up before she stopped sliding, and the first swarm creature that charged her received a burst of armor-piercing incendiary rounds directly into its open mouth. It exploded. She was already moving to the next target before the pieces hit the ground. The swarm ground forms were terrifying. To most species, they were evolved killing machines, fast, armored, relentless. But humans were killing machines too. They're powered exoskeletons let them punch through chitin with their bare fists. Their weapons fired rounds designed to penetrate and then ignite, burning the swarm creatures from the inside out, and they fought with a coordination and ferocity that the swarm had never encountered. Soreth watched from his tower as a human soldier was knocked down by a creature 3 times her size. The creature's claws tore into her shoulder, ripping through armor and flesh. Blood sprayed across the scorched ground. Any other species would have died. Any other species would have at least stopped fighting. The human screamed, rolled, shoved the barrel of her sidearm under the creature's jaw and fired until it stopped moving. Then she stood up, blood running down her arm, switched her rifle to her remaining good hand, and kept fighting. Soreth Aid was staring, his beak hanging open. What world, Soreth whispered, breeds creatures like this? Above in orbit, the battle reached its turning point. The fighter wings had found and destroyed enough nerve clusters to disrupt the swarms. Coordination around the planet. Dreadnought line, battered and burning, but still holding, pushed forward into the gaps. Ruck ordered a concentrated strike on the swarm's central mass cluster, the largest concentration of bioships in orbit, and every ship that could still fire poured everything it had into that single point. The mass cluster shattered. Thousands of bioships suddenly cut off from the coordination signals that guided them began to drift and collide. The orbital siege of Palavas Prime was broken. In the CIC, Ruck received the casualty report: 31 ships destroyed, over 4,000 dead. He closed his eyes for just a moment. The mask of command slipped, and Lyra saw something underneath. Not coldness, not calm, but a grief so deep it had its own gravity. Then he opened his eyes. Signal all ships, he said. Press the advance. We're not done yet. The swarm was retreating, and that was not a good sign. In the days following the Battle of Palavas Prime, the remaining swarm forces pulled away from the Dravani homeworld and began moving deeper into the nebula that bordered the palace. reach sector they did not flee in. Panic. The swarm did not understand. Panic, they moved with purpose, consolidating, drawing their scattered forces together like a wounded animal, pulling its limbs close to its body. Admiral Ruck watched the tactical displays aboard the damaged Thermopylae and understood what was happening. Immediately, the swarm was not giving up. It was regrouping around something important. "They're pulling back to their nexus," said Commander Priya Vasquez, Ruck's chief intelligence officer. She stood beside him in the war room, pointing at the holographic map of the nebula. Deep inside it, barely visible through layers of stellar dust and radiation, was a single massive signature. "We've confirmed it with the Dravani deep scan data. That is a moon-sized bioship, the largest single swarm organism ever detected. And the nexus is inside it," Rourke said. "Yes, sir, the central intelligence node that coordinates all swarm activity in this sector, possibly all swarm activity everywhere." Rourke leaned forward, studying the display around the moonship. Thousands of bioships were gathering. The swarm was building a wall of living tissue between the fleet and its brain. In a field hospital on the surface of Palavas Prime, Lyra Snorts found herself sitting beside a bed where a human marine was having a shattered leg reconstructed by a medical team that worked with the calm efficiency of people who did this every day. The marine, a corporal barely older than 20, was awake, biting down on a piece of rubber, his hands gripping the bed frame so hard the metal bent. He did not scream. His eyes were wet, but he did not scream. Lyra's species did not cry. They flickered, their bioluminescence dimming and brightening in patterns that expressed grief. She was flickering now, watching this boy endure something that would have killed a Velathi outright. Castillo found her there an hour later. The sergeant had a bandaged shoulder where the swarm creature had torn into her during the ground battle, but she moved like the wound did not exist. Lyra had learned that humans did this. They pushed pain to the side and kept moving. It was not bravery exactly. It was something deeper, something wired into their biology. Their ancestors had survived on Earth by refusing to stop, no matter what, and that refusal lived in every human Lyra had met. "They want me at the War Council," Castillo said. "You should come." The War Council convened in a clear Dravani government building in Valeth. The crystal walls were cracked but still standing, rock-attended via holographic projection from the Thermopylae. Talon General Sorath was there in person, his silver feathers ruffled, his amber eyes sharp despite the exhaustion that hung on him like a weight. Beside Rock's projection stood Commander Vasquez, who had spent the past 48 hours working with rescued Dravani scientists to analyze every piece of data they had on the swarm. What she had found changed everything. The swarm was not a natural evolution, Vasquez said. She put up a holographic display showing ancient data recovered from Dravani archives, records so old they predated the Dravani civilization itself, left behind by a species that no longer existed. It was engineered, a bioweapon created by a civilization. "We're calling the architects. They built the swarm as a defense system, self-replicating army designed to consume any threat to their territory." The room was silent. "The architects lost control," Vasquez continued. "The nexus, the central Control node was damaged, we don't know how, but the result was that the swarms programming degraded to a single command, running on an endless loop: consume, replicate, expand. The architects were the first to be eaten by their own creation. That was approximately 11,000 years ago. Sareth made a sound deep in his throat, a Dravani expression of horror. It was never alive, he said. It was a machine, a broken machine. Yes, Vasquez said, and like any machine, it has an off switch. If we destroy the Nexus, the entire swarm collapses. Every bioship, every ground form, every organism connected to the collective intelligence goes inert. It all stops. The silence in the room changed. It went from hopeless to something else, something sharp. The problem, Rourke said, is getting to it. The Snort's Nexus is buried deep inside the moonship, protected by layers of organic armor thicker than our heaviest ordnance can penetrate from orbit, and the moonship is surrounded by the largest concentration of swarm defenders in the sector. A conventional siege would take months. The Dravani's other two worlds don't have months, so we don't siege it, Castillo said. Every eye turned to her. She was the lowest ranking person in the room, and she did not seem to care. We go in. Strike team, small, fast, and hard. The Dravani deep scans show structural weaknesses in the moonship's outer shell. Growth seams where the bio-armor is thinnest. We breach through one of those, fight our way to the Nexus core, and destroy it from inside. Rourke looked at her for a long moment. You understand what you're describing, Sergeant? Yes, sir, I do. Everyone in the room understood. A strike team inside the swarm central organism, surrounded by its densest defenses, cut off from support with one objective and almost no chance of making it back out. It was not a difficult mission, it was a suicide mission. Rourke asked for volunteers. Every Marine in the fleet stepped forward. Every single one. The strike team was assembled, 200 of the best, drawn from every division in the fleet. Castillo was field promoted to lieutenant and given command. She chose her people carefully, the toughest, the most experienced, the ones who understood what they were signing up for and wanted to go anyway. Then Lyra volunteered. Castillo stared at her. You weigh 40 kilos, you've never fired a weapon. You glow in the dark. I am the only person here who can interface with the architect's biotech knowledge, Lyra said. Her voice was small, but it did not shake. The data we recovered from the archives is written in a biochemical language that requires a species with chemical receptor communication to decode. That is what Velathi antennae do. Without me, you will wander through that moonship blind. With me, I can guide you to the Nexus core. Castillo looked at Rox's projection. The Admiral nodded. All right, Castillo said, stay close to me, don't touch anything, and if something comes at you, get behind the nearest Marine. Sareth rose from his seat. His damaged wing hung at his side, but his eyes were burning. The Stormwing still flies, he said. The Stormwing was the last surviving Dravani warship, an ancient cruiser that had been old when Sareth was young. My crew and I will join the assault. You will not fight for my people alone. Rox's expression softened. It was a small thing, barely visible, but Lyra saw it. Talon General it would be in honor. The fleet moved into the nebula 3 days later. The plan was brutally simple. The Main fleet would engage the swarms. Defenders around the moonship, drawing their attention and creating chaos. Under cover of that chaos, a small group of modified boarding craft carrying the strike team would slip through the outer defenses, breach the moonship's shell, and begin their descent toward the Nexus. The battle erupted almost immediately. The nebula lit up with railgun fire and the silent explosions of dying bioships. The Thermopylae led the charge, its battered hull taking hit after hit as it pushed deeper into the swarm's formation. The Stormwing flew at its side, smaller and older but just as stubborn, its Dravani crew firing weapons that had not been used in generations. In the chaos, the boarding craft slipped through. They hit the moonship's surface at speed, punching through a growth seam that Lyra had identified from the scan data. The craft buried itself in layers of organic matter and came to stop in a tunnel of living tissue. Castillo was the first one out. The air inside the moonship was thick, warm, and wet. It smelled like rotting vegetation and something older, something chemical and wrong. The walls pulsed with a slow, rhythmic movement, the heartbeat of the organism. They were now inside. Bioluminescent veins ran along the ceiling, casting everything in a sickly green light. Lyra stepped out behind her antennae twitching wildly as they sampled the chemical signals in the air. She could read this place. The walls were talking to her in a language that was 11,000 years old, and she understood it. The Nexus core is approximately 4 km below us, she said. I can feel it. Signals get stronger the deeper we go. Castillo checked her rifle, looked snorts at her 200 Marines standing in the pools in green darkness, and nodded. Stay close, she said. Stay loud, and if something moves, kill it twice. They began their descent into the heart of the swarm. The tunnels inside the moonship were alive, and they did not want visitors. The strike team moved downward through corridors of bone and sinew that twisted and branched in patterns no architect would ever design. The walls breathed. The floor shifted under their boots like the skin of a sleeping animal. Fluid dripped from the ceiling in slow, warm drops that hissed against their armor. And from the deeper darkness ahead, they could hear things moving. Lyra walked behind Castillo, her antennae stretched forward, reading the chemical language embedded in every surface around her. The architects had built their creation with a kind of terrible elegance. Every tunnel, every chamber, every pulsing vein of bioluminescent fluid was part of a system, a living network that carried information, nutrients, and commands from the Nexus core to every corner of the swarm. Lyra could feel the core pulling at her senses like a heartbeat, growing louder with each step downward. Left at the next junction, she said. The signal density increases on that path. Copy, Castillo said. She held up a fist and the column stopped. 2 scouts moved ahead, their weapons sweeping the green-lit corridor. One of them signaled clear, and they moved on. They made it almost a full kilometer before the swarm found them. The first attack came from the walls themselves. Sections of organic matter split open like wounds, and creatures poured out. Swarm defenders bred specifically for close quarters combat inside the moonship. They were smaller than the ground forms on Palaven's prime, but faster, with bladed limbs and acid-dripping jaws, designed to shred intruders in tight spaces. The Marines opened fire. In the enclosed tunnel, the sound was overwhelming, the roar of rifles, the wet crack of chitin splitting, the screams of creatures that had no mouths, but screamed anyway through vibrations. In their bodies, Castillo stood at the front of the line, firing controlled bursts, dropping two creatures with every breath. Behind her, Marines fought in pairs, covering each other, filling the tunnel with light and noise and death. They killed everything that came at them, but the tunnel behind them was littered with spent casings and blood, not all of it belonging to the swarm. 8 Marines were down, 3 were dead. The medics worked fast, patching wounds and injecting stimulants, getting the wounded back on their feet. Keep moving, Castillo ordered. There was no other option. Stopping meant dying. They fought their way down through 2 more kilometers of tunnels that grew narrower and hotter with each level. The swarm threw everything it had at them, waves of defenders, clouds of toxic spores, sections of tunnel that collapsed and had to be blasted through. The strike team left a trail of destroyed bioforms behind them, but the cost mounted with every engagement. By the time they reached the 3 km mark, they had lost 60 people. Lyra kept them moving in the right direction. She had become essential. Without her ability to read the biochemical signals in the walls, they would have been lost within the first hour. She was terrified. Her glow had gone completely dark, and her hands trembled so badly she could barely hold the scanner she carried, but she did not stop. She kept her antennae forward, kept reading, kept guiding. Castillo noticed, during a brief pause, while the team secured a junction, she knelt beside Lyra and put a hand on the Velatha's thin shoulder. Even through the powered exoskeleton, the touch was gentle. "You're doing great," Castillo said. Lyra looked up at her with compound eyes that reflected the green light in 1,000 facets. "I am doing terribly," she said. "I have been terrified since we entered this thing." Castillo smiled. "That's what doing great looks like, being scared and doing it anyway. That's all courage is." Far above them, outside the moon ship, the fleet was dying. The battle in the nebula had become a grinding war of attrition. The swarm's defenders threw themselves at the human ships in endless waves, and the human ships threw fire back. But there were always more swarm, and the fleet's ammunition was not infinite. Rock stood on the bridge of the Thermopylae and watched the tactical display shift from bad to worse. The dreadnought line was buckling. 3 more ships had been lost in the past hour. The swarm was focusing its attacks on the carriers now, trying to destroy the fighter bays that were doing so much damage to its formations. He made a decision. "Helm," he said, "plot a ramming course for the primary defensive cluster around the moon ship's equator, all ahead." "Full." His bridge crew looked at him. No one argued, no one hesitated. They had served with Rock long enough to know that when the Admiral gave an order in that tone, it was because he had already considered every other option and discarded them. "All ahead, full." The helmsman said. The Thermopylae surged forward, 3.2 km of battered, burning dreadnought, accelerating into the heart of the swarm's defensive ring. Bioships threw themselves at it, latching onto the hull, trying to slow it down. The Thermopylae's remaining weapons fired in every direction, clearing a path through sheer violence. The storm wing flew beside it. Sorth stood on his bridge, his talons gripping the command rail, his amber eyes fixed. On the moon ship ahead, his ship was old and small and outgunned, but it was Draveni, and the Draveni did not abandon those who fought for them. All weapons forward arc, Sorth said. Clear the way for the Thermopylae. The two ships, one human, one Draveni, charged the defensive cluster together. The Storm Wing's guns blazed, tearing apart bioships that tried to intercept the Dreadnought's course. The Thermopylae hit the cluster at full speed, its armored prow smashing through a wall of living ships, and the explosion tore a hole in the swarm's defenses wide enough for the rest of the fleet to pour through. The Thermopylae survived barely. Half of its decks were open to space. Its engines were failing, but its crew was still alive, and so was its admiral. Deep inside the moonship, the strike team heard the impact as a distant thunder that shook the walls around them. Castillo checked her tactical display and saw the update from the fleet. The outer defenses were broken, but that would not matter if they did not finish this. They reached the Nexus core 20 minutes later. The chamber was enormous. It opened up from the narrow tunnels like a cathedral, carved from living tissue, its ceiling lost in darkness high above. The walls pulsed with bioluminescent veins that all converged on a single point at the center, a crystalline structure roughly the size of a house, embedded in a mass of organic matter that connected it to every part of the moon ship. The Nexus, the brain of the swarm. Lyra's antennae nearly bent double under the force of the signals pouring from it. She could feel the ancient command echoing through the network, not words, not thoughts, just a single instruction, repeating endlessly, a broken loop that had been running for 11,000 years. Consume, replicate, expand. It was not malice, it was not evil, it was a machine following corrupted orders. And somewhere inside that crystal, buried under millennia of damage and degradation, was the original programming, the language of the architects who had built it. I can read it, Lyra said. Her voice was barely a whisper. I can feel the original code. The shutdown sequence is still in there, fragmented but present. If I can interface with the node and broadcast a termination command through the network using the charges to amplify the signal, it might propagate faster than the Nexus can resist. Might, Castillo said. The alternative is that we simply destroy the crystal and hope the swarm collapses on its own, but the network is distributed without the termination signal. Individual swarm organisms might continue to function for weeks, even months. Millions would die. Then we do it your way, Castillo said. Plant the charges, Lyra, do whatever you need to do. The Marines spread out through the chamber, placing demolition charges on the Nexus crystal and the surrounding organic structures. Lyra approached the crystal itself, her small hands shaking, her antennae extended. She placed her palms against the surface and felt the full force of the swarm's broken mind wash over her. It was agony, 11,000 years of mindless hunger and expansion compressed into a single screaming signal that tried to overwhelm her nervous system. She gritted her mandibles, pushed back, and dug deeper. Beneath the corruption she found fragments of the original code, elegant, precise, beautiful in a way that made her want to weep for the civilization that had created it and then been destroyed by it. She reconstructed the termination sequence. It was not complete. She had to fill gaps with her own biochemical signatures, bridging the broken logic with Velathi communication protocols that were just compatible enough to carry the signal. It was crude, it was desperate, it was the best she could do. The swarm found them. Defenders poured into the chamber from every tunnel, every crack in the walls. Hundreds of them, then thousands. The Nexus was protecting itself, throwing every organism it could reach at the intruders who threatened its core. The remaining Marines, 140 of the original 200, formed a perimeter around Lyra and the crystal. They fought with everything they had left. Rifles ran dry and were replaced with sidearms. Sidearms ran dry and were replaced with blades and fists and boots. The powered exoskeletons amplified every punch, every kick, every desperate strike, and Marines who could not stand anymore fought from their knees. Castillo stood directly in front of Lyra, her rifle barking, her voice hoarse from shouting orders. A swarm creature got past her guard and slashed across her chest, tearing through her armor. She grabbed it by the jaw, crushed it against the floor, and kept firing. Lyra, she screamed, now would be good. Lyra opened her eyes. The termination signal was ready. It was crude, patched together, held in her mind like a glass sculpture balanced on a needle. She took one breath, connected it to the demolition charges amplification network, and released it into the crystal. Fire the charges, she cried. Castillo hit the detonator. The Nexus crystal shattered. The termination signal, amplified by the explosions, raced outward through the bioorganic network at the speed of thought. It spread through the moonship, through the bioships in orbit, through the ground forms on the surface of Palavis Prime, through every connected organism in the sector. And the swarm stopped. Bioships that had been attacking the fleet went rigid, their engines dying, their weapons going silent. Ground forms on the surface of Palavis Prime collapsed mid-stride, their bodies going limp. Inside the moonship, the defenders that had been charging the Marines simply fell where they stood like puppets whose strings had been cut. The heartbeat in the walls went silent. For the first time in 11,000 years, the swarm was still. In the chamber, in the ruins of the Nexus, the surviving Marines stood in a silence so complete it hurt. 60 of them were left standing. Many would not stand for much longer. Lyra lay on the ground beside the shattered crystal, unconscious, her glow flickering faintly. Castillo holstered her weapon, knelt beside Lyra, and carefully lifted the small Velathi onto her back. Then she looked at her Marines. We're leaving, she said. Everyone who can walk, help everyone who can't. We're getting out of here. They climbed back through the dead tunnels of the moonship, carrying their wounded, carrying their dead where they could, leaving markers where they could. Not the walls no longer pulsed. The air was still. The creature they were inside was dying, and its death was quiet. The fleet recovered them 4 hours later. Of 142 warships, 47 were destroyed. Most of the rest would need months in dry dock. Over 11,000 humans were dead. The strike team had lost 140 of 200. But the Dravani were alive. 3 worlds, billions of people, an entire civilization saved from extinction. The Galactic Concord convened a special session 3 weeks later. Every species sent representatives. The chamber was full in a way it had not been in decades. and the silence when the session opened was heavy with something none of them had a word for. Talon General Soreth was asked to address the council. He stood on the speaker's platform, his silver feathers catching the light, his repaired wing folded carefully at his side. He looked out at the assembled delegates, hundreds of species, most of whom had voted to sacrifice his people to buy time. You asked me to describe the humans, he said. His voice was rough and it carried. Many of you feared them. I understand why. They come from a world that would kill any of us in hours. They are strong beyond reason. They heal from wounds that would end our lives. They carry weapons in their blood and bones, forged by a planet that spent 4 billion years trying to destroy them. He paused. But that is not what defines them. When my people cried out into the dark, the humans answered. They crossed 6 relay jumps in days. They brought a war fleet into a battle they had no obligation to fight against an enemy that outnumbered them beyond counting. For a species they had never met. They bled for us, they died for us, not for territory, not for resources, not for power. They did it because someone was in danger and they could help. He looked across the chamber, his amber eyes bright and fierce. You ask what the humans are. They are not conquerors, they are not beasts. They are the universe's answer to a question every frightened civilization has asked since the first star was lit. If the darkness comes, will anyone come to help? His voice dropped and every being in the chamber leaned forward to hear. The Deathworlders came and they brought the fire with them. The chamber was silent for a very long time. On Earth, on a quiet hillside overlooking the Pacific Ocean, new stones were set into the ground in long, careful rows. Each one bore a name. Each name was human, and beside each name, carved in flowing Dravani script that caught the sunlight like crystal, was a single word that translated roughly to a concept that existed in every language the galaxy had ever known. Guardian. The wind off the ocean moved through the grass and the stone stood, and the names endured, and across the galaxy when species spoke of Earth, they no longer spoke with fear. They spoke with something much older and much more powerful. They spoke with hope.